Good evening. We're going to spend a few minutes discussing some of the process and components of Chapter 2. And it delves into ethics and understanding a bit about ethics when it involves research. Ethics is a unique component. Oftentimes you hear people say that ethics is a misnomer or business ethics don't go hand in hand. Realistically speaking, organizations that perform high levels of ethical standards also perform at a higher level at retained earnings per employee and earnings per share for your shareholders. So being ethical is extremely important to include the research projects that you do. It doesn't matter your personal ethical philosophy or your funnel as you may seek. Whether you are taking a deontological approach or teleological approach is not the issue here. It is the ethical standards that you follow as you're conducting your research. One of the things to think about is very simple. Many of you are very familiar with quantum physics or the observation effect. Even in that process, it basically states that anything that you observe, no matter how removed from the situation you are, has impact on the surroundings. So even being removed, you're still going to impact a setting no matter how slight the observation may appear to be. And thinking of that from a qualitative standpoint, observation is an amazing thing to utilize as a research tool. But even in that level, we have to have an ethical approach. The chapter talks a little bit about the IRB, or International Review Board, and that basically is reminding you that there are times when you have to have someone else, a group of individuals, approve your research before you can conduct it. And we have to think about historically some of the studies that have been done without someone's consent, and that goes to things such as the Tuskegee Airmen is just one example of using human subjects in a medical experiment. And there are many more examples of that. But the process is getting consent. So part of your research as you're going through, whether you are doing an interview or whether you're conducting a survey, and that can be digital consent or hard physical consent that you sign. And these are documents that you keep on record, and you keep them stored away in a secure area as part of that ethical process. And the consent is them stating very clearly that they understand. And so I want to talk about a couple of points that they go right down in Chapter 2. And basically it gives you a nice breakdown. It's on page 31 of your book, and it talks about the things that are needed in your consent. And basically you're talking about who you are, a quick introduction of the project itself, what we'll be discussing during the period, if there are any sponsors. In other words, are you being paid, or does your survey have a grant? Who is covering that? Okay. It talks a little bit about the purpose. It lets them know that there is the most important element, anonymity. And what you're going to run into as you do some of your research is fear, bias. And a lot of times, again, as I mentioned in one of our previous videos, when you conduct an exit interview, that's the best time to get the information, because there is no fear or bias of repercussions. And so sometimes we may even include, in your book talks about deception, and that may be part of that. But at the end, if you are doing any components of deception, even in your disclosure statement, you need to debrief them and explain any deception that was included. That's extremely important and part of the process. We want to keep in mind also, you're not paying someone for their time. So it is voluntary, and that they're not being reimbursed for that. We want to remember the highest level of standards, and within that process, we have to start thinking about capacity and where you're gaining your information and how you gained your information. Even if it's quantitative, where did that material come from? Is it a true acceptable source? A quick example is thinking about the university that was hired by NATO to look at and review global warming, starting out as a very simple grant, and they did a meta-analysis. In other words, mass amounts of information from all over the globe. And initially they saw results of global warming. But that through efforts and through energy of other countries, and again, this isn't talking about the ethics of global warming, that started to actually level. It wasn't like we weren't climbing, but the speed we were climbing, some of our efforts were actually yielding results. Now, with any bit of statistics, in the next chapter we'll talk about variables. You throw in one variable or remove a variable, it changes basically the inline or the information that you're receiving or handing out. And so we have to start thinking about where we're gaining that information. And if it's one-on-one or through an interview process, we also have to think about the capacity. So not just where we're getting it from a quantitative, but from a qualitative standpoint, we have to start thinking about, do they have capacity? Okay, if they have mental incapacity, you're not getting informed consent. Children. Higher level of standard doing any research that involves children, and you will definitely need a board review for that. If you're dealing with anyone that's in a controlled environment, i.e. prisoners, you could do a research into discussing information with the guards, with those that are in administration, but those that are in captivity without high levels of IRB approval is not an ethical research project. And those that are unknown participants, again, we're thinking about not only ethics, but safety of those individuals involved. So we want to make sure that they understand all of the philosophy behind ethics, where you're gaining your information, that they have informed consent, that you're storing that away, and that they're well assured of anonymity. That will not only ease the process, but open up some of the information that you're gaining as you try and relax the individuals that you're working with to gather this information. Because withholding information takes away in research what we call the aha moments, where something stands out. Seeing repetitive information shows us a trend, but we're looking for what's off of the beaten path, or in that trend, what is consistent that you say, aha. And that leads you down that path of research. So as you're going through this process, I encourage you to not only read all of the information in Chapter 2, but consider the approach and the ethical standards that you utilize. So again, not getting just information from your organization or externally, but getting approval, and from every individual that you're going to interview or survey. I look forward to working with you again on the next chapter. You guys have a wonderful evening.